Jimmy Page was 29, a rock star selling the fantasy of absolute freedom. Lori Maddox was 14, a child allegedly instructed to hide in the dark corners of a hotel suite to avoid being seen. While Led Zeppelin filled stadiums, the world around him, according to later accounts, appears to have sustained a system of secrecy. Freight elevators, paid-off silence, withheld identification. She was not treated like a muse in any meaningful sense. She was treated like someone who had to be concealed. It was a pattern long whispered about behind the locked doors of the Sunset Strip. At the time, parts of the music press used language that softened or glamorized relationships involving very young girls around famous musicians. That framing helped normalize conduct that today is far more clearly understood as deeply harmful, highly coercive, and shaped by a severe imbalance of power. In Lori Maddox's case, the more important question is not how the culture described her, but how an underage girl could be drawn into an adult world that failed to protect her. According to later accounts, Lori Maddox was often kept out of public view while staying in hotel rooms connected to the band's world. If those accounts are accurate, the pattern points to secrecy, isolation, and a situation in which a teenager's freedom and normal contact with the outside world were heavily restricted. Several retellings describe moments when she allegedly had to stay out of sight whenever hotel staff or outsiders were nearby. Even without repeating the most graphic details, that image alone suggests a relationship built not on openness or equality, but on concealment and control. This repeated hiding systematically stripped away her basic sense of freedom. Page controlled her physical movements. He dictated the space she was allowed to occupy. Every time she was made to hide in a dark closet, another layer of emotional conditioning took hold. She was taught that her existence had to stay concealed. She was trained to believe that she was something shameful, something that needed to be kept out of sight from the legitimate world. This constant reinforcement of her own illegitimacy was an insidious form of profound emotional toll. It eroded her identity from the inside out. The Sunset Strip in the early 70s was a dangerous environment for vulnerable teenagers. Older men with unlimited money and unchecked power moved through the clubs and diners, looking for runaways and starstruck girls. The counterculture of the time provided a near-perfect cover for systemic manipulation. The popular mantra of free love was twisted and weaponized by men in power. It became an ideological shield used to justify the pressuring of the young and naive. Men like Page presented themselves as liberators, rescuing these girls from conservative limits. In reality, they were drawing them deeper into systems built around adult power and adolescent vulnerability. Lori Maddox was the perfect target. She was young, she was pretty, and she was desperate to be part of the glamorous scene she saw in the magazines. She walked straight into a highly controlled situation, designed by men who knew exactly how to manipulate a child's desire to feel important. But keeping a middle school student hidden inside a major hotel requires more than just a locked door. It requires massive logistical support. It requires the active complicity of dozens of adults. It requires a network of professionals willing to look the other way for a paycheck. A 14-year-old girl cannot simply bypass the strict security protocols of a major hotel and ride the elevator up to the penthouse suite of a global superstar. She did not get there by accident. She appears, from these accounts, to have been moved through a system that protected secrecy. The entourage surrounding the band functioned as a network of enablers. They utilized the hotel's freight elevators. These were the dark industrial shafts used for moving luggage and room service carts, far away from the eyes of the public and legitimate guests. Men in expensive suits and tour jackets allegedly escorted a child through these service routes, treating her less like a person than like something that needed to stay unseen. They allegedly took control of her identification. They allegedly paid for silence from people whose job was to notice irregularities. This was not a secret kept by one man. It was a pattern that, according to the article's logic, survived because too many people had reasons not to interfere. Record executives, tour managers, and hotel authorities are portrayed here as looking the other way. They prioritize the massive revenue generated by the tour over the safety and basic rights of a minor. They allowed a global icon at minimum to move through a world where scrutiny was weak and consequences were distant because the financial stakes were too high for anyone to risk scandal. Jimmy Page operated within an impenetrable bubble of privilege. He moved through a world where few people seemed willing to challenge him. Hotel management was unlikely to confront its most valuable client. Music journalists had little incentive to expose behavior that might cost them access to his inner circle. The reporters were invited to the parties. They drank the free liquor. They flew on the private jet. Their silence was reinforced by proximity, status, and reward. Every time a major music magazine printed a breezy, colorful article about the rock scene's youngest followers, the trap of normalization closed a little tighter around Lori Maddox. The culture validated her isolation. The journalists normalized the highly questionable dynamic. They created an environment where a 28-year-old man could allegedly keep a child under severe control and face almost no legal or social repercussions. She was trapped inside a fortress financed by money and guarded by complicity. The isolation began to warp her understanding of reality. Cut off from her peers, her family, and any normal social interaction, the world inside the suite became the only world that mattered. The man controlling access to that world became the absolute center of her universe. The emotional manipulation was not a sudden violent break. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of identity. Jimmy Page is portrayed here as someone who understood the force of isolation. He did not need physical chains or iron bars to keep Lori Maddox inside that world. He used something more effective and more destructive. He used isolation. By severing her ties to the outside world, he became her primary point of reference. He became her singular authority. A 14-year-old girl is still forming. Her personality is still developing. Her understanding of the world is fragile. Page appears to have understood this vulnerability well. He worked, according to this portrayal, to overwrite the identity of a junior high school student with a new persona shaped for his world. He dictated her wardrobe. The environment demanded a specific aesthetic. She abandoned typical teenage clothing for heavy velvet, sheer silk, and restrictive leather. She adopted thick, heavy stage makeup. She wasn't just dressing up. The strict visual requirements of his world pushed her to actively mask the unfinished features of a child. Page required her to look like a hardened, experienced adult woman. He needed the visual illusion to satisfy his own neuroses and to maintain the specific aesthetic of his environment. If she wore what he selected, she received his attention. The attention of a major rock star can be intoxicating to a child. It is overwhelming. It feels like validation. If she deviated from his instructions, she received his silence. In a locked hotel room, silence becomes a harsh disciplinary tool. It is suffocating. It breeds panic. She quickly learned to anticipate his desires. She monitored his moods. She adapted. She shed her own adolescent interests and adopted a hollow manufactured sophistication. She stopped acting like a teenager because being a teenager was no longer useful for her survival in that room. She became a mirror reflecting only what the man standing in front of her wanted to see. Her reality was strictly controlled. While she occasionally mingled in the underground Hollywood nightlife with other teenage groups, her existence inside the Hyatt was dictated entirely by Paige. The California sun was banished behind heavy blackout curtains. Her universe shrank to the square footage of the master suite, where the hours stretched into days. There were no school bells or family dinners. There was only the endless hum of the air conditioning, the flickering blue light of the television, and the perpetual wait for his return. She waited. Her entire existence was reduced to a state of perpetual waiting. She waited for the sound of the key in the lock. She waited for a command. This forced idleness is a recognized technique in intense emotional pressure. It breaks down resistance. It creates a profound dependency on the controlling figure. When Paige finally returned, his presence was the only stimulus in her deadened world. He became her savior from the crushing boredom, cementing his total control over her emotional state. This level of operational security required professional enforcement. Jimmy Page was the star, but he was not the logistics manager. He did not negotiate with the hotel staff. He did not coordinate the transport. The man who executed the quiet logistics was Richard Cole. Cole was the tour manager for Led Zeppelin. He was not a musician. He was an operational enforcer. He was the fixer figure in the machine. He is portrayed here as someone whose primary job was to protect the band and facilitate its offstage world, regardless of ethics and at times legality. Cole was the gatekeeper of that sealed environment. He controlled the perimeter. He managed the private security structure that traveled with the band. Cole, in this account, orchestrated Lori Maddox's movement with calculated secrecy. A child cannot walk through the lobby of the Continental Hyatt House without drawing attention. The lobby was swarming with fans, journalists, and police officers. Cole utilized the hotel's back-channel infrastructure. He moved her late at night. He escorted her through loading areas. He brought her into the freight elevators. These were the dark service shafts used for moving heavy road cases, laundry carts, and other hotel traffic. Lori Maddox was allegedly moved through the hidden infrastructure of the hotel, far from public view. Cole stood beside her in the rattling metal cage of the service elevator, making sure she was not seen. He held her identification documents. This was a critical element of control. Without a driver's license or a passport, a 14-year-old runaway has almost no leverage. She cannot board an airplane. She cannot rent her own room. She cannot easily prove her identity to authorities. By controlling her papers, the people around her ensured that she remained dependent on their network for survival. The protection machine extended far beyond the tour manager. The entire operation was bankrolled and shielded by corporate capitalism. Led Zeppelin was signed to Atlantic Records. The executives sitting in high-rise corner offices in Manhattan were not ignorant. They funded the tours. They approved the massive budgets. They saw the financial statements. The accountants processed the expense reports. They saw the exorbitant cash advances. They saw the receipts for destroyed hotel rooms. They saw the payoffs categorized under vague, miscellaneous operational costs. The executives may not have needed to know every detail to benefit from the system around the band. The article argues that they had little incentive to ask hard questions. Led Zeppelin generated millions of dollars in revenue. They sold millions of records. They sold out stadiums across the globe. The profit margins were astronomical. In that environment, the corporate instinct was to protect the machine. Financial gains outweighed ethical urgency, and disturbing realities were easier to ignore than confront. Atlantic Records provided part of the financial infrastructure surrounding a band that had become too profitable to challenge easily. The article treats that corporate shield as one reason Page could move through the era with extraordinary insulation. Money did not prove every allegation, but it did help create distance from accountability. A local police precinct in Los Angeles might launch a raid on a street-level dealer, but they hesitate to kick down the door of the penthouse suite when the occupants are backed by a multinational corporation with a fleet of high-priced defense attorneys on retainer. The corporate shield made the rock star untouchable. The executives signed the checks, washed their hands, and looked the other way while a child sat locked in a closet. The management and staff of the Continental Hyatt House were equally complicit. A major hotel is a living organism. It is impossible to hide a person in a room for an extended period without the staff noticing. Someone in management likely knew. Security likely noticed. The maids almost certainly saw signs that something was wrong. When a housekeeper entered the master suite to make the bed, the evidence was in plain sight. There were 2 glasses on the nightstand. There was heavy makeup scattered across the bathroom vanity. There were clothes draped over chairs that clearly belonged to a very young girl. Sometimes the maid heard a muffled noise coming from the closet. She saw the closet door slightly ajar, but she kept her head down. She smoothed the bed sheets. She emptied the ashtrays. She took the crisp $100 bill left explicitly on the table as a tip. The tip was not simply payment for good service. In this telling, it functioned as money meant to discourage questions. The entire ecosystem of the hotel was compromised by the massive influx of rock and roll cash. The security guards took financial arrangements to clear the hallways. The concierge took arrangements to ignore the unauthorized guests. The hotel ceased to be a public accommodation and transformed into an independent sovereign state where federal and state welfare laws were completely suspended. The staff traded their moral compass for $100 bills. Every employee who took the money and stayed silent became a cog in the machine that crushed Lori Maddox. The music press provided the final layer of armor for this operation. The journalists who covered the band were not investigative reporters. They were access journalists. Their careers, their status, and their paychecks depended entirely on maintaining good relationships with the rock stars and the record labels. They desperately wanted to be part of the inner circle. She accepts the locked doors and the heavy curtains as a twisted form of affection, but a growing individual begins to change. The brain continues to develop. The fog of total isolation begins to lift slightly. Questions begin to form. She might hesitate before hiding in a closet. She might show a flicker of autonomy. For a man who demands absolute, unquestioning control, a single flicker of autonomy is a threat. It makes the captive obsolete. The novelty wore off. Page did not seem to view Lori Maddox as a full human being with her own future. He appears in this account to have treated her as something temporary and replaceable. When that role no longer suited him, she could be pushed aside to make room for someone else. The eviction was not a dramatic confrontation. There were no arguments. There were no tears from the controller. There was no formal breakup because there had never been a legitimate relationship. The termination of her isolation was handled like a minor administrative procedure. Page did not pack her bags. He did not look her in the eye and say goodbye. He simply left the hotel room for a sound check one afternoon and never returned to that specific suite. He left others to handle the removal of the human impact. The enforcer arrived. Richard Cole stepped into the master suite. He did not offer an explanation. He did not offer an apology. He tossed a cheap duffel bag onto the bed. He told her to pack. He informed her that the tour was moving to a different city, and she was not on the passenger manifest. The operation was over. The machine had consumed what it needed, and she was simply discarded. There was no severance package. There was no transition plan. There was no plane ticket home. Cole took control of the exit. He escorted her out of the suite. He did not take her down the grand staircase. He led her back to the freight elevator. The metal cage rattled as it descended from the penthouse. They reached the ground floor service area. The executives and the reporters all read the same magazines. They all propagated the same myth. The creation of specific industry terms was a collaborative effort. It served to sanitize a severe ethical breach. It provided the adults in the room with plausible deniability. The executives in New York could read an article about the wild scene and tell themselves that these were worldly, experienced young women making their own rebellious choices. They willfully ignored a profound reality. A severely inexperienced individual cannot comprehend such a dynamic. They cannot navigate an overwhelming power imbalance. The media provided the vocabulary that the corporate machine used to absolve itself of guilt. They printed glossy photographs of the musicians standing next to young girls. They wrote lengthy poetic features romanticizing the lifestyle on the Sunset Strip. They framed the manipulation as an essential component of the rock and roll lifestyle. They never published the truth. They never wrote about the freight elevators. They never wrote about the locked doors. They never wrote about the sheer, profound distress of a profoundly isolated individual. The press functioned, in effect, as image management for a culture built on exploitation. The days in the riot house blurred into weeks. The tour moved from city to city, and the logistical machine moved the cargo with it. The process repeated itself in different hotels in different states. The service elevators, the financial arrangements, the locked doors, the closets. The geography changed, but the secluded space remained exactly the same. The emotional conditioning solidified. Lori Maddox was losing her grip on her own past. The memories of her normal life before the hotel rooms were fading. She was becoming institutionalized. She was adapting to her extreme isolation because she believed there was no other way to exist. Jimmy Page maintained overwhelming control. He paraded her inside the private suites for his own amusement. He demanded absolute compliance. He was a controlling man presiding over a world built for one person's needs. His ego required constant reflection, and he had shaped a child into someone meant to mirror his own desires. He was consuming her youth to sustain his own sense of power. The machine continued to operate flawlessly. The money continued to flow. The music continued to play. And the girl remained in the dark, waiting for the heavy wooden door to open. The passage of time is the enemy of the controlling figure. A year crawled by inside the velvet-lined suite. The calendar turned. Lori Maddox turned 15. The biological reality of her aging triggered the end of her confinement. Jimmy Page required the absolute submission of a child. He fed on the total lack of worldly experience. A 14-year-old girl is easily paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of a global superstar. Cole directed her toward the alleyway. The heavy metal door shut behind her. The separation was final. Lori Maddox stood on the concrete. The California sun was blinding. She had not seen unfiltered daylight in months. The heat radiating from the asphalt was suffocating. She was an individual who should have still been in a state of protected adolescence. She was attired in an artificial adult persona with the clothing and style funded by a global superstar. She possessed no financial resources. She had no identification documents. She had no clear pathway back to a stable, safe home. The transition from the isolated penthouse to the harsh pavement was instantaneous. It left her entirely disoriented and stripped of defenses. Many retrospective accounts suggest her internal psychological framework had been systematically deconstructed by a controlling figure. She had been conditioned to exist primarily within the narrow parameters of a private suite. The environment was based on obedience and strictly restricted access. Out on the street, there were no commands. There were no instructions. There was only the roar of traffic and the harsh reality of unexpected survival. She wandered the Sunset Strip, disoriented and entirely disconnected from the reality around her. She had forgotten how to interact with people her own age. She had struggled to re-engage with normal society. She had been, in effect, institutionalized by her profound isolation. Street-level opportunists recognized this severe vulnerability immediately. The Strip was populated by individuals who knew how to identify weakness. They targeted the isolated. They sought out those who appeared discarded by others. They observed a young individual with a vacant gaze, walking aimlessly in weathered clothes. They deduced the kind of environment she had likely emerged from. They understood she had been pushed out of the exclusive VIP ecosystem. They closed in. She possessed few defenses left. The intense power imbalance in her previous life had systematically stripped away much of her capacity for self-protection. She had been taught to be compliant to powerful figures. He had instructed her to yield to aggressive demands. When older men approached her on the street, she did not retreat. She did not resist. She merely moved straight into the next form of systemic manipulation. Many psychologists suggest a developing mind cannot process the profound impact of a sudden absolute shift from extreme isolation to total abandonment without severe consequences. The reality outside the hotel room was frequently intolerable. It made destructive self-medication an easy, immediate escape. For some, powerful chemical substances offer a temporary shield against an overwhelming reality. They do not solve the deep-seated trauma. They simply bury it, forcing a rapid, destructive cycle of dependency just to endure the memories of the private suites. High above the grime of the city, the starship took off. The customized Boeing 720 passenger jet belonged to Led Zeppelin. It was a famous symbol of rock royalty. It featured a brass-trimmed bar, a built-in organ, and a master bedroom. Jimmy Page sat in the luxury cabin. He drank expensive spirits. He tuned his guitar. He prepared for another sold-out arena show. Page would step onto a massive stage that evening. Thousands upon thousands of people would scream his name in a frenzy of adoration. He would perform extended musical solos, and the crowd would worship him as a living deity. He would generate millions of dollars in revenue in a single evening. He would then return to a new hotel in a new city. A new suite would be prepared. The environment of restricted access and total compliance would likely continue. Historical accounts frequently suggest he moved on from the situation seamlessly. Observers of that era viewed her as having been used by a system that consumed what it desired. She was left behind, a minor consequence of an industry built on access. His life accelerated into unprecedented global influence and extreme wealth. Her life, meanwhile, fractured into severe challenges and total obscurity. He appeared to suffer few tangible consequences. Retrospective accounts strongly suggest she suffered a lifetime of profound emotional turmoil. This immense disparity was not accidental. It was actively engineered and protected by the dominant media of the era. The music press functioned in many ways as the public relations arm for this culture. Editors at major publications looked at photographs of men in their late 20s, traveling with severely underage individuals. Instead of questioning the severe ethical breaches, they sent the images to the printers. By coining specific sanitized industry terms, magazines transformed a serious exploitation into a bohemian trend. They romanticized the immense power imbalance to protect their VIP access. This action effectively gaslighted an entire generation of affected individuals. And, enriching the elite, a 14-year-old girl had zero economic value. She was expendable. Justice in Los Angeles effectively ended at the threshold of the penthouse suite. The evidence is burned onto photographic film. Archival photographs from 1973 capture the stark reality that magazines tried to conceal. You see Jimmy Page. He is a fully formed adult man. He has the hardened features of a seasoned touring musician. He projects absolute power, total entitlement, and unyielding control. He holds a cigarette. He drinks expensive whiskey. He looks completely relaxed. Beside him stands a child. Past the heavy black eyeliner, the absurdly tall platform, shoes, and the velvet pants purchased to age her, the bone structure remains soft. The cheeks hold the roundness of youth. Her wide eyes do not possess the confident gaze of a worldly woman. They suggest the vacant look of someone overwhelmed and trapped. Her posture betrays the lie. She does not stand with the relaxed confidence of a partner. She stands stiffly. She leans away slightly. She looks like a prop positioned by a stage director. The physical contrast between the two figures is nauseating, a visual definition of a severe imbalance. It is a middle school student standing next to a man pushing 30. It is an image that, in hindsight, feels less like promotion and more like evidence of a grotesque dynamic. The press printed these photos. The editors at the major publications looked at these exact images. They saw the childish awkwardness. They cropped the photos. They adjusted the lighting. They placed them next to bold, exciting headlines. They printed the age of the victim directly in the text. They wrote the words 14 years old and felt absolutely no moral revulsion. The journalists interviewed these children. The transcripts of these old interviews are documents of profound moral bankruptcy. The reporters asked a child who was being held in a hotel room about her favorite fashion designers. They asked her what it was like to date a rock star. They asked her about the music. They treated a severe, ongoing distress as a lifestyle choice. They normalized the unthinkable. When a reporter asks a 14-year-old girl about her relationship with a 28-year-old man and does not respond with alarm, that reporter is helping normalize conduct that should have triggered intervention. The entire media apparatus operated as an impenetrable shield. They convinced the public that the age of consent was a flexible concept, entirely dependent on the fame and the talent of the perpetrator. The enduring legacy of these platinum records carries a hidden cost. The millions of dollars generated by the industry were built, in part, on the silent pain of girls like Lori Maddox. The music survived, but the history of its creation remains permanently stained. The aftermath reveals the unvarnished cruelty of the system, illustrated starkly by their divergent paths. Jimmy Page aged into an elder statesman of rock and roll. He continued to tour the world. He amassed an enormous, untouchable fortune. He lived in castles in England. He was honored by prestigious institutions. He was invited to meet world leaders. He was given awards by the Queen. He was treated with reverence and respect by the exact same media that helped cover up his offenses. He never faced a judge. He never faced a jury. He never sat in a jail cell. He lived a life of ultimate privilege, completely and permanently insulated from the consequences of his actions in 1973. Lori Maddox was left to navigate the ruins of a shattered life. The damage inflicted during her most formative, vulnerable years was permanent. You cannot take a child, isolate her, subject her to intense emotional pressure, use her as a commodity, and then expect her to integrate back into normal society. Her developmental process was violently interrupted. She was left with severe emotional distress. She struggled with heavy dependency as a direct coping mechanism. She struggled to form healthy, trusting relationships. She carried the heavy, silent, crushing burden of a profound distress that the rest of the world actively celebrated as a glamorous era of music history. The system fiercely protected the millionaire and completely abandoned the child. The disparity in their outcomes is the ultimate proof of a corrupt society. Page was rewarded with immortality and wealth. Maddox was condemned to obscurity and psychological pain. The riot house wasn't an isolated incident. It was an operational pattern. The music industry in the 1970s often functioned like an unregulated frontier where men with unlimited money could gain access to vulnerable youth, and the press would eagerly romanticize the culture surrounding it. The luxury hotel suites were fortresses of impunity. The service elevators were routes of concealment. The tour managers were the people who kept the machinery running. Nostalgia softens the sharp edges of brutality, stripping away the velvet, the leather, and the sequins of the Sunset Strip exposes the cold, mechanical gears of systematic control. The romanticized terminology of the era served only to protect the powerful and silence those affected. A 14-year-old girl hiding in a dark bathroom while a maid cleans a hotel room is not a fun rock and roll anecdote. It is a deeply disturbing reality. It is a moment of profound, paralyzing fear experienced by a child who had been systematically stripped of her voice, her agency, and her basic human freedom. The truth remains absolute regardless of how many records were sold or how many stadiums were filled. Jimmy Page, as portrayed in these accounts, used immense wealth, global fame, and the silence of a wider industry to exercise severe control over a minor. He weaponized his power in ways that, if these accounts are true, helped destroy a childhood for his own advantage. There is no moral defense for this. There is no justification. The Continental Hyatt House suite in this telling functioned like a sealed chamber of control. The legacy is stained by the manipulation of the vulnerable. The allegations are too serious to be waved away by nostalgia. The history of rock and roll is heavily fortified by myths and legends designed to protect the powerful. The music will survive, but it will always carry the heavy, undeniable silence of those locked in the dark. The industry proved its golden rule. With enough money, fame, and complicity, terrible conduct can be minimized, romanticized, and absorbed into legend. Meanwhile, Lori Maddox was left standing on the concrete, permanently shut out from the world that helped break her.